Ladies and gentlemen, there is a conference hosted by Bart Ehrman with 10 world-class scholars. Insights into the New Testament. They're new insights, and this is the name of the conference. I hope you'll sign up today. Down in the description, mythvisionpodcast.com/NT conference. You guys go sign up right now. I hope to see you there. Great scholars. And today, I have a special guest that's never been on Mythvision, but I swear, you're not supposed to swear, but I promise that the work he is doing on the Johannine Gospels is exactly what you and I crave. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to our guest, Dr. Hugo Mendez. Professor Hugo Mendez, welcome to Mythvision.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for giving us a little bit of your time to tease us on the lecture that you're going to be doing in this conference. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into that? Who are you and your background for our audience in case they wonder?
Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm a colleague of Bart Ehrman's here in the department. And this is my 8th year at UNC. I previously was at Yale University for 2 years and graduated from the University of Georgia. I teach New Testament and early Christianity here at UNC. So I look at Christianity in the first 5 centuries. My first book was The Cult of Stephen in Jerusalem, Inventing a Patron Martyr. It's all about how the Church of Jerusalem, to accomplish political aims, invented all sorts of traditions about Stephen, fabricated his relics, and tried to position itself as really the center of Stephen cult interest, devotion in the ancient Mediterranean world. I'm currently now coming out this December, the co-author with Bart Ehrman of the 8th edition of the New Testament with Oxford University Press, which is a standard textbook in our field here in the United States. And otherwise, working now on my next project. My next project looks at the origin of the Gospel of John. And what I'm arguing is that the Gospel of John is an example of disguised authorship, false authorship from the ancient world. The author of John invented this figure of the disciple whom Jesus loved, precisely to give his work a certain level of authority and authenticity it wouldn't have had. I'm working on also another project that's taking that more forward, particularly with reference to the epistles, which I see as continuations of that tradition. Later authors who, looking at this character that had been invented in the gospel, decided to co-opt, to hijack his voice and to deploy him for new polemical agendas. So yeah, invention, forgery, these are kind of the center of what I'm interested in New Testament early Christianity.
That is exactly why I told everybody at the beginning of this video why we have to have Dr. Mendez back to talk about this work. And your publication sometime, fingers crossed, will be out later this year, possibly early next year. I cannot wait to read that myself. So this is a tease for the future interview that we will have on your work, but also the conference. I imagine you're going to go down into some weeds in this conference in giving us evidences or reasons why you take this position.
Yeah, so for this conference, I'm giving a paper called Unlocking the Symbolism of the Fourth Gospel. So one of the most essential things that I think people are always interested in is, how much do we really know about the historical Jesus? What can we say about Jesus from a historical perspective? And of course, the problem is we have these sources that come to us. The earliest sources for the life of Jesus are the Gospels, and they're shot through with religious agendas, and that's always a question. So I focus particularly on the Gospel of John. And, the challenge with the Gospel of John in particular is that it contains narratives, events of the life of Jesus that appear in no other gospel. There's been a lot of energy in the study of the Gospel of John for the last 30 years around the question of, is there something that we can recover that's historical? Can we excavate this text and at least pull out nuggets of Jesus really did this and Jesus really did that? What my presentation is doing is it's looking at the gospel a little bit of a different way. The gospel is fundamentally literature, right? It's a text that tells a story and it has a storyteller behind it. And one of the things that literary critics of the gospel have understood very clearly since the 1980s is that the Gospel of John is deeply saturated with symbolism. In many ways, I personally, as a scholar, think that we haven't gone far enough sometimes in understanding how much of the gospel is symbolic, how creative the gospel writer was. So what I do in this presentation is I invite the listeners, everyone joining us for this conference, to learn the practice that I teach in my own classroom of reading John backwards. We have to start, I think, with John, with the ideas of John, the theology, the kind of worldview outlook, because this is fundamentally what the author wanted to push on his readers. Right. He wanted them to believe this very particular vision of precisely, it's a view of Jesus, but it's a view of human exaltation, of how human beings can be born of spirit, access celestial realms, how they can acquire eternal life now, and how they can acquire existences like those of celestial beings. It's when we understand what the gospel writer is trying to press to his audience that we can begin to understand the literary structure of the text. So why does the author write this narrative? What is the purpose of this story? Why does he use these motifs or keep bringing up these key words? In many ways, understanding the theology of John unlocks the symbolism that saturates the book. It kind of makes the whole gospel light up, I think. So I'll be trying to kind of explain that practice in the presentation. I think that ultimately that does circle us back to the question of historicity. You know, it's when we understand, I think, how inventive, how creative, how willing potentially to manipulate, alter, enrich earlier materials the author is, that we can begin to, I think, better understand the questions that historians might ask of this text. We begin to see how literary it really is, and perhaps maybe a little less of the kind of historical source that we have tended to think.
In the future, I would love to do a deep dive into the weeds with you once this conference is over and we can go into John and the symbolism, what the repercussions are of the method people are using on trying to sweep away a fossil behind all of this heavy cloud of theology, symbolism, storytelling, inventive, creative ideas like this. And is this a hopeless endeavor, as Thomas L. Thompson in his book in the 70s was diving into Abraham and the patriarchal narratives? I love what he said in the book. He was pretty cutthroat, but he was pretty blunt. And he says, look, we have concrete archaeological stuff, and then we have these narratives. And a lot of what the scholars for a very long time, I mean, since the church fathers were trying to pin these guys into history, Eusebius, the historian's trying to say, here's where he was in history, things like that. You have this method, they'll say, like the name. Let's see where this name is anchored in history and if it was used or provoked anywhere in history. And therefore, if there's a name, that means he might have existed, as if you and me couldn't find in ancient literature names of archaic people who are from regions we want our people to be from, and you couldn't be inventive or creative. And that's what Thompson, I think, did that really turned over the consensus in many ways of like this futile attempt of historicizing what happened. So you and me could, I think, go down an interesting rabbit trail of the things you've learned and teach and help people realize maybe that could be applied at least to the Gospel of John, since that's your specialty.
Yeah.
I just recently read that book. That's why I was like, okay, it was a heavy read, but I was thinking about it because you brought up some things that sounded somewhat like what he said, but I'm looking forward to this. I hope that people will go down in the description, sign up for the conference, and also get one of Dr. Mendez's books. I hope that people will check out your work, because what you've teased me with already is a path I've been on. And it just sounds to me, I don't know, maybe your opinion before we let you go on this is, do you think that the method is dated? This approach of trying to find the fossils of the historical this or the historical that, not saying it couldn't be a possible guess, but do you think it's futile on any certainty or trying to be very confident about anything that actually is in the Gospel of John being historical?
I mean, I still like the exercise, right? I still think, you're always going to be fascinated by that question. I mean, history as a discipline is still going to want to excavate the past
Right.
and draw out something. I think that what we don't tend to realize, though, is what soil we're digging in, right? And how we're supposed to work with that soil. And I kind of find that people tend to be on very different extremes of this, right? There can be the very dismissive attitude. Well, of course, we know this is religiously biased and all these sorts of things, and that's great. Or of course, we want to find real history and we need to find real history, and we just need to develop the right methodology, the right algorithm almost, that we can pull all the words of the text through and find it. I think that although I think historical research has a place, though, the fun of history is not necessarily what we end up finding about the historical Jesus, but even what we find out about the historical author of John, about John itself as a text. Yeah, I think the one thing that always stands out to me as a scholar is that, in my opinion, the scholars who are so focused on trying to find historical nuggets in John, who are really confident that there are historical elements to be found in John, I think are some of the worst readers of the gospel. I don't think that they're the people who necessarily grasp how the theology comes together in this text and what really that theology says. I don't think they're very good readers of the narratives of the text. They don't see symbolism. They stay so much on the plane of these sorts of historical questions that they're not seeing what the author is doing all around. So, biblical studies is a very diverse field. We have lots of different channels of inquiry, right? There are folks who do historical criticism. There are folks who do literary criticism, who are interested in these sorts of questions, motifs, themes, narrative construction. And I think that we need conversations between all of us. We really need folks at the same table thinking with each other and not siloing so much, because I think we answer all of our respective questions a lot better, right? Literary critics, I think, answer their questions about the gospel better when they understand more of its context. Historical critics, I don't think, can do what they do with a literary text until they recognize it's a literary text.
I love what you said. You said, what soil are they working with? And imagine you're building in the ancient world a clay hut, but you're working with black dirt. You have the wrong building materials to attempt to accomplish what you think you're going to. Bad analogy, it falls apart at many points, but I think what you're suggesting is, if you aren't aware of what you're looking at and dealing with to begin with, it's like, I guess, if we went to read Homer, another analogy that's more realistic but still falls apart, if we go to read Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey and we're hunting it as if it's historical record, you're going to find verisimilitude, or they, like in the classicist world, they call it realisms. And it's like, we're going to find this, we're going to find a place, we're going to find geographical locations or sea regions or this and that, shipwreck, this, that. Same stuff you might see in Acts, same stuff you might see in some ways in the Gospels. But what are you reading? Yeah. I mean, if you don't realize Odysseus, king of Ithaca, and the symbolism of the gods, and you're missing the boat. You're trying to historicize something that was never the intent. There was really they have a message. They're convincing you of the gospel. They want you to believe. It's not, hi, I'm in the future history classes that are coming down the road. I want to, it's much more than that. So that was my takeaway. Correct me if I'm wrong on that.
No, I mean, I think you're right. And you know where we do this? We do this with the apocryphal gospels, the non-canonical gospels, right? We look at the Gospel of Thomas, and when we teach it in the classroom, when we talk about it, we're very interested in the, quote, Gnostic theology of this text. We're interested in understanding its very particular vision of human nature and human origins and human destiny. And we think that radically reshapes the material inside the text. But it's funny, when we get to the Gospels in the New Testament, the canonical bias kicks in that I think keeps us so eagle-eyed sometimes on historical questions in terms that we don't tend to ask always about other texts. Gospel of Mary might be a better example. Just these gospels that so clearly are putting words on Jesus's lips, are inventing scenarios, narrative frames for these sayings. I think if there's one thing that really animates my scholarship, it's how would we read the Gospel of John if we read it the way we would read the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary? What if we discovered it tomorrow in Nag Hammadi rather than have been sitting on it for 2,000 years?
Wow.
What would we do with it, and how would we feel about it?
I love what you just said. I have to make one comment because
Sure.
I can already see that we're going to have some great interviews down the road. I'm so mesmerized by this. Richard C. Miller, Robin Faith Walsh. I've talked to several of these kind of mixture between classicists / New Testament scholars. Mm-hmm. And it kind of sounds like what I see, his historicizing attempt is almost an apologetic, even though I think it's framed into serious historical rigor to try and find it. You're digging in the wrong soil, as you said, to use your words. So we're not dealing with history text. That doesn't mean there isn't realisms, historical verisimilitude. But I'm looking at this and I'm saying, why do we have this vast, I don't care about numbers. I've given wrong numbers. I heard someone said there was 94 gospels. That's probably not true. That's exaggerated. But there's so many gospels, let's say dozens. And
we don't have them all, right?
Right.
We don't.
And who knows, at the end of the day, for what I'm not counting that were there might have been more than 94 for all I know. I could be wrong. It just, to me, why do we look at these? You're making me think of the question. Why do we say these 4 need to be historical, and then we just don't look at the Acts of Peter? We don't look at the other, we include Acts 2 in that historical journey. What is it? Is it because of this being canon that has framed this kind of golden shell of these are really the ones that are true and historical, and we don't treat the same kind of genre that may be clearly exaggerated in several ways, more so than these 4, but there's still exaggerations I find in these 4 that make me go, this sounds like literature. It sounds like interesting, fanciful theology and other things. What is your answer to that question about why do we treat these on a pedestal of history and the rest fit some other category?
Yeah. And I should add the caveat here, right, that there have been scholars who have tried to do that operation with the Gospel of Thomas. It's a minority sort of view that would really try to give the Gospel of Thomas a really good historical anchor, at least from the perspective of our scholarship today in the 2020s, right? But, for these texts that are written, clearly in the 2nd century, again, Gospel of Mary is a great example of this. Jesus is talking about planetary spheres, essentially, the soul is ascending through the powers that the soul encounters. I mean, people aren't working with that, asking historical questions. And so what is the difference? I think some of the difference is really familiarity, over familiarity with the Gospels, and to some extent. We can talk about canonical bias. We can talk about religious bias. But I think that we're so used to reading the Gospel of John. And what, of course, has happened over the course of history is that Christian theology has taken language from John and fit it into molds that we think of as Catholic or Lutheran or something like that through history. It has taken images from John and it has adapted it to Trinitarian theology in the 4th century. And so by the time it filters to us today as a book, all we can see are the 2,000 years between us and the text. What we miss is just how weird this text is. When you start to read it on its own landscape, when you start to read it side by side with other texts of the period that actually are obviously far more like it than, for instance, the Nicene Creed is like the Gospel of John, or the Summa Theologica, or the Catechism of the Catholic Church is. So, I think that part of what I enjoy doing in the classroom, what I enjoy hopefully doing in this lecture in a couple weeks, I really enjoy defamiliarizing the gospel. I like taking the gospel, kind of wiping the slate a little bit for my students, for publics that I address of, what do we think about this text? How do we understand this text? Start from scratch and then let the text light up with new connections. Let's see it in a new frame.
I hope that everybody watching this will go sign up mythvisionpodcast.com/NT conference. You won't want to miss this. Dr. Hugo Mendez, I love what you've said. I can't wait to learn from you more. I know for a fact that we have so much that we could do in the future to our audience for learning. And I can't wait for your new book to come out so we can promote that. Let me know when that happens so we can do this. Tell us what you think already in the comment section down below. Hit the like button, subscribe, check out the conference. I'm going to be there, and I hope that you will too. Thank you for your time, Dr. Mendez.
Thank you for having me.